The rain hit the windows of Marlow Hall like small stones, and Duke Alastair Marlow stood frozen in the hallway, staring at a letter he had read 100 times before. It was the report from the night his wife died. Tonight, for no reason he could explain, his hands were shaking as he held it again. A year had passed since the carriage went off the bridge at Ashcombe Pass. A year since Elena, his wife, his Duchess, had vanished into the black water below, and her body was never truly found. Only a torn piece of her blue traveling coat caught on the rocks downstream. The court had accepted that as proof enough. Alastair had not. He walked to the window and watched the storm bend the old oak trees in the courtyard. Somewhere in this same kind of rain, 1 year ago, she had left the house angry with him, climbed into that carriage and never come back. He remembered every word of their last conversation, and every word still burned. "You do not trust me," she had said, her eyes bright with anger and hurt. "You never have." He had not denied it. That was the terrible part. He had let her walk out into the storm without a single word to stop her, certain she would return once she had calmed down, certain there would be another day to make things right. There had been no other day. A soft knock came at the door. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Constance, entered without waiting for an answer, as she always did. Her face carried the same worry it had worn for months. "You are standing in the dark again," she said gently. "The staff are frightened to disturb you." "I am only thinking," Alastair answered, folding the letter and placing it back inside his coat. "You think too much and eat too little," Constance said. "Alastair, it has been a year. The house cannot stay a tomb forever. You have duties. The estate needs an heir. The name needs to continue." "I am aware of my duties, mother." "Are you, because from where I stand, you have buried yourself beside her, even though there is no grave to bury yourself in?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, and she looked away, ashamed of her own bluntness. Alastair said nothing. There was nothing to say that would satisfy her, because the truth was simpler and darker than duty. He did not want another wife. He wanted answers. Something about that night had never settled correctly in his mind, like a key that almost fit a lock but would not turn. The official story was simple. The carriage wheel had broken on the old stone bridge during the storm, the horses had panicked, and the carriage had gone over the side into the river. The coachman, a loyal man named Ferris, had died in the accident as well, thrown clear onto the rocks. Elena's body had never been recovered, but enough evidence remained for the court to declare her deceased. Yet Alastair had ridden that road 100 times. He knew that bridge, knew its stones, knew the strength of its old rail. A wheel simply breaking, on the one night that mattered most, felt too convenient, too neat, like something arranged rather than something that happened. He had asked the wheelwright who built the carriage about it once, quietly, without his mother's knowledge. The man had looked uneasy and said the wheel had been inspected only weeks before the accident and had shown no weakness at all. Alastair had let the matter drop at the time, telling himself grief was making him imagine conspiracies where there were none, but the doubt had never fully left him. He walked to his study, poured a small glass of brandy he did not drink, and sat before the cold fireplace. On the desk in front of him sat a small portrait of Elena, painted the year they married. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, her green eyes looking directly at the painter with the same stubborn brightness they always held in life. She had never been the kind of woman to sit quietly and accept things. She questioned everything, argued with him about the estate's finances, about the treatment of the tenants, about matters most wives of her rank were expected to leave entirely to their husbands. It was one of the reasons he had loved her so completely, and one of the reasons their last argument had cut so deep. She had discovered something in the estate ledgers that troubled her, something about payments to a supplier that did not match any actual goods delivered. She had brought it to him with concern in her voice, and he, exhausted from a difficult week and irritated at being questioned about his own affairs, had dismissed her, told her the accounts were not her concern, and suggested she was seeing problems that did not exist. It was the worst thing he had ever said to her, and it was the last thing he had said to her before she stormed out to visit her sister in the neighboring town, taking the carriage into the storm. Alastair rubbed his eyes and forced the memory away. Dwelling on it accomplished nothing. He had spent a year drowning in guilt, and guilt alone could not bring her back. The next morning, business called him away from the estate. There was a shipment of grain to inspect in the market town of Ashford, a task he would normally leave to his steward, but he welcomed any excuse to leave the quiet, grieving halls of Marlow Hall for a few hours. He rode out with 2 of his men, grateful for the cold wind on his face and the simple motion of the horse beneath him. Ashford was a busy town on market day, filled with carts, merchants calling out prices, and the noise of ordinary life continuing as it always did, indifferent to his private sorrow. Alastair moved through the crowd toward the grain merchant's stall, his mind still partly back at the hall, partly on the ledger discrepancy Alina had once tried to show him. It was then that he saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the market square near a small apothecary shop, adjusting a basket on her arm. She wore a plain grey dress, nothing like the fine gowns Alina had worn as Duchess, and her hair was tied back simply beneath a modest bonnet. But the tilt of her head as she laughed at something the shopkeeper said, the particular way she brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, the graceful line of her neck as she turned, all of it struck him like a blow to the chest. For a moment, Alastair could not breathe. His heart pounded so hard he thought the people around him must be able to hear it. It could not be her, it was simply not possible, and yet every instinct in his body screamed that it was. "Alina," he said, so quietly it was barely a whisper, and then louder, pushing forward through the crowd. "Alina." The woman's head turned sharply at the sound, and for one impossible second, her eyes met his across the square. Green eyes, the exact shade he had memorized 1,000 times in quiet moments of grief. Her face went pale, and something like fear flickered across her features before she turned and hurried away, disappearing quickly into a narrow side street between two shops. Alastair broke into a run, shoving past startled market-goers, ignoring the calls of his men behind him. He reached the mouth of the side street within seconds, but it was empty. A cat darted across the cobblestones. A door somewhere slammed shut. The woman, whoever she was, had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. He stood there, breathing hard, his heart still racing, staring down the empty street as the rain that had threatened all morning finally began to fall. His men caught up to him moments later, concerned by his sudden sprint through the crowd. "Your Grace, is everything all right?" one of them asked, watching him carefully. Alastair did not answer immediately. He turned back toward the market square, scanning every face, every doorway, every window, searching for a glimpse of grey fabric or dark hair. There was nothing. The ordinary business of the market continued around him as though nothing extraordinary had just happened, as though the whole world had not just tilted sideways beneath his feet. "Your Grace," the man repeated. "It was nothing," Alastair said finally, though his voice did not sound convinced even to his own ears. "A trick of the light, let us finish our business here." But as they walked back toward the grain merchant's stall, Alastair could not stop his eyes from drifting back toward the small apothecary shop where he had first seen her. A wooden sign above the door read "Quinn's Remedies," painted in simple faded letters. He memorized it without meaning to, the way a drowning man memorizes the shape of a floating branch. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Alastair inspected the grain, spoke with the merchant, signed the necessary papers, and did all of it without truly being present in his own body. His mind kept returning to that one frozen second in the market square, to those green eyes meeting his own, to the fear that had crossed her face before she ran. Why would a stranger run from him in fear, unless she was not a stranger at all? By the time they rode back toward Marlow Hall that evening, the rain had turned into a steady downpour, and Alastair barely noticed it soaking through his coat. His mind turned over every possible explanation. Perhaps it was simply a woman who resembled Alina closely, and grief had made him see connections that did not exist. It would not be the first time his mind had played such tricks in the past year. He had seen her in crowds before, in the shape of a stranger's shoulders, in the color of a passing carriage, only to feel the crushing disappointment when the illusion faded. But this had felt different. The eyes, the laugh, the small gesture with her hair, all of it had matched too precisely to be coincidence. And there was the fear in her expression when she saw him, the way she had fled without hesitation, as though she recognized him and did not want to be found. That night Alastair did not sleep. He sat in his study long after the rest of the household had gone to bed, staring at Alina's portrait, turning the day's events over and over in his mind. If there was even the smallest chance that the woman in the market square was somehow connected to his wife, he could not simply let the matter rest. He owed Alina that much, after failing her so completely on the last night of her life, or what he had believed was the last night of her life. He made a decision before the candle beside him burned down to nothing. He would return to Ashford. He would find the apothecary shop called Quinn's Remedies, and he would learn the truth, no matter what it cost him or where it led. Somewhere in that small market town, a woman with his wife's face and his wife's eyes was hiding from him, and Alastair Marlowe intended to find out why. Outside, the storm continued through the night, rain hammering against the old stone walls of Marlow Hall, as though the sky itself remembered the night that had taken everything from him, and was now, impossibly, threatening to give a piece of it back. The candle finally burned out sometime near dawn, but Alastair did not move from his chair. He sat in the darkness, listening to the rain fade into a soft drizzle, and for the first time in a year felt something other than grief stirring inside his chest. It was not hope exactly, not yet. It was something quieter and more dangerous than hope. It was the beginning of a question that would not let him rest until it was answered, and Alastair Marlow had never in his life been a man who could leave a question unanswered. The house around him remained silent, unaware that the careful, grieving peace it had settled into over the past year was about to be shattered completely, and that nothing at Marlow Hall or in the quiet market town of Ashford would ever be quite the same again. Days later, when the household staff whispered among themselves about the sudden change in their master, none of them could have guessed the true reason. They only knew that the Duke, who had barely left his study in months, was now riding out toward Ashford almost every day, his expression unreadable, his purpose unknown to anyone but himself. And in a small apothecary shop on the edge of that market town, a woman who called herself Mara Quinn watched the road nervously each morning, wondering how much longer her carefully built quiet life could possibly last. The steward, a careful older man named Nathaniel Cole who had served the Marlow family for over 20 years, was the first to notice the shift in his master's behavior. He said nothing at first, only watched, the way a loyal servant learns to watch without being asked. But when the Duke returned from Ashford for the third day in a row, his boots muddy, his eyes distant, Nathaniel finally allowed himself to ask a single quiet question as he took the Duke's coat. "Did you find something in town, Your Grace?" Alastair paused, his hand still on the doorframe, and for a long moment did not answer. Then he said only, "Perhaps, I am not certain yet." It was not much of an answer, but it was enough to tell Nathaniel that something had changed, something significant enough to pull his master out of a year of silent grief and back into the world. Whatever it was, Nathaniel suspected it would not stay quiet for long. A hand grabbed Alastair's shoulder from behind, and he spun around fast enough to startle the stable boy who had touched him. "Forgive me, Your Grace," the boy stammered, stepping back quickly. "Your horse is ready." Alastair exhaled slowly and forced his shoulders to relax. He had not realized how tightly he was wounded, how every sound behind him now made his pulse jump. It had been 4 days since he saw her face in the market square, and in that time he had barely slept, barely eaten, and thought of nothing else. He mounted his horse without another word and rode out from Marlow Hall before the sun had fully risen. His mother had noticed his early departures, of course. She noticed everything. 2 nights ago she had confronted him directly at dinner, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "You have been riding to Ashford nearly every day," Constance had said, her tone carefully even. "What business could possibly require so much attention there?" "Grain prices," Alastair had answered, the lie coming smoothly enough that she had let the matter drop, though the look she gave him suggested she did not fully believe it. He hated lying to his mother, but the truth was too fragile, too impossible to speak aloud yet. If he told her he believed he had seen Alina alive, walking through a market square in a plain grey dress, she would think grief had finally broken his mind completely. Perhaps she would even be right to think so. But Alastair had never been a man ruled by fantasy. He had built the estate's finances back from near ruin after his father's careless years, negotiated fair contracts with tenant farmers who trusted almost no one from the manor house, and managed every crisis with a clear, careful head. He did not imagine things, he verified them. And so, before returning to the market square again, he had done something he should have done a year earlier. He rode first to the small cottage near the river where the coachman Ferris had lived with his wife and 2 children. The cottage looked smaller than he remembered, its gardens slightly overgrown, as though grief had taken the strength out of the family that once tended it so carefully. Mrs. Ferris answered the door herself, and her face went through several emotions at once upon seeing the Duke standing on her step, surprise and old grief and something that looked almost like wariness. "Your Grace," she said, dipping into a quick, uncertain curtsy, "this is unexpected." "Forgive the intrusion," Alastair said. "I wish to ask you something about that night, about your husband." Her expression tightened. "I have told the magistrate everything I know, sir, which was very little. My husband left that evening to drive the Duchess to her sister's home, and he never returned." "Did he say anything unusual before he left?" Anything about the carriage, or the wheel, or anyone he had spoken with recently? Mrs. Ferris hesitated, and in that hesitation Alastair felt something sharpen inside his chest. He did mention something, she said slowly. A few days before he said a man had come to inspect the carriage while I was resting, said it was routine, sent from the estate. My husband thought nothing of it at the time, he only mentioned it in passing because the man seemed to know his way around the stables a little too well for someone he did not recognize. Did he give a name? No, sir, only that he wore fine clothes for a stable hand, and left before my husband could ask too many questions. Alastair felt the ground shift slightly beneath him, the way it had in the market square days before. Fine clothes for a stable hand, someone who came to inspect the carriage without being summoned by anyone Alastair himself knew of. He thanked Mrs. Ferris, offered his condolences again though the words felt hollow after a year, and rode away with a new and colder question turning over in his mind. Someone had tampered with the carriage. He was now nearly certain of it, and if someone had deliberately caused that accident, then the woman he had seen in the market square, the woman with Alina's eyes and Alina's laugh, might not be a trick of grief at all. She might be exactly who his heart insisted she was, a woman who had survived whatever happened on that bridge and had every reason in the world to disappear and never be found. The thought terrified him as much as it thrilled him. If Alina was alive and hiding, she was hiding from someone. And if that someone had been willing to sabotage a carriage to be rid of her once, they would not hesitate to try again if they learned she still lived. He reached Ashford by mid-morning and went straight to the narrow street where the apothecary shop stood. Quinn's Remedies looked ordinary enough from the outside, its windows lined with jars of dried herbs and small glass bottles, a bell hanging above the door to announce visitors. Alastair stood across the street for a long moment, simply watching, gathering the courage he had not needed since the night he first proposed marriage to Alina at her father's country house, nervous and uncertain despite all his rank and confidence. Finally, he crossed the street and pushed the door open. The bell rang softly above him. The shop was small and smelled of dried lavender and something sharper, perhaps mint or camphor. Shelves lined every wall, crowded with labeled jars and bundles of herbs hanging from the low ceiling beams. Behind the counter stood an older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, who looked up at him with polite curiosity. "Good day, sir, how may I help you?" Alastair's heart sank slightly, disappointment cutting through him before he could stop it. "I am looking for a young woman I saw here several days ago, dark hair, grey dress. She may work here or be connected to the shop somehow." The older woman's expression shifted, something careful and guarded settling behind her eyes. "That would be my niece, Mara. She helps me with the shop from time to time. May I ask your business with her?" "I believe I may know her," Alastair said carefully, watching the woman's face for any reaction. "From some time ago." "Mara does not have many acquaintances outside Ashford," the woman said, her tone polite but firm, the kind of firmness that closes a door as effectively as any lock. "She keeps to herself. I am sure you are mistaken, sir." "Is she here today?" "She is not," the woman answered smoothly, too smoothly. "She has gone to visit relatives in the north for a fortnight." Alastair did not believe her for a single moment. The lie sat uneasily on the older woman's face, in the slight tightness around her mouth, the way her hands gripped the counter's edge a little too firmly. But he also understood with sudden and painful clarity that pressing the matter further here would accomplish nothing except making the woman more guarded and more likely to warn her niece away entirely. "I see," he said instead, forcing his voice into calm, even tones. "Please forgive the intrusion. If I am mistaken, I apologize for troubling you." He left the shop with the bell ringing softly behind him and stood on the street outside for a long moment thinking. The aunt had lied to protect Mara, which meant Mara had asked to be protected, which meant she knew exactly who Alastair was and had chosen deliberately to hide from him. A stranger would not inspire such careful, immediate secrecy. Only someone with real history, real reason to fear him, or fear what finding her again might mean. He spent the rest of the day walking the streets of Ashford at a distance, watching the apothecary shop from the corner of a bakery across the square, hoping for even a glimpse of grey fabric or dark hair through the shop's front window. She did not appear. Either she was truly gone, sent away by her aunt for safety, or she was hiding somewhere inside, waiting for him to give up and leave. By the time evening fell and the market square emptied of its usual crowds, Alastair finally admitted defeat for the day and turned his horse back toward Marlow Hall. but his mind would not rest. Every piece of information he had gathered fit together into a shape he did not want to look at directly, because looking at it directly meant confronting the possibility that someone close to his own family, someone with access to the estate stables, someone who stood to gain from Alina's death, had deliberately arranged the accident that took her from him. The list of people with reason to want Alina gone, or to want Alistair himself vulnerable and grieving, was short but troubling. His cousin Edmund Marlowe stood next in line for the title should Alistair die without an heir, a fact that had never troubled Alistair before that moment, but now sat cold and heavy in his stomach. Edmund had always been pleasant enough at family gatherings, quick with a joke, generous with compliments, but Alistair had never fully trusted the easy charm behind which Edmund seemed to hide something calculating. There was also the matter of the ledger discrepancy Alina had tried to show him before their final argument, payments made to a supplier for goods that were never delivered. He had dismissed her concerns that night, too tired and too proud to listen properly. Now he wondered, with a growing sense of dread, whether that ledger held the key to everything, whether Alina had stumbled upon evidence of theft or fraud significant enough that someone had decided she needed to be silenced before she could expose it. He resolved to examine the estate ledgers himself the moment he returned home, no matter how late the hour, and to do so quietly, without alerting anyone who might have reason to hide the truth from him. Marlowe Hall was dark and silent when he arrived, most of the household already asleep. Alistair went directly to the estate office, lit a single candle, and pulled the ledgers from the previous 2 years down from their shelf. He worked through the night, comparing entries, cross-referencing supplier names with delivery records, his exhaustion forgotten in the growing certainty that he was finally, after a year of blind grief, approaching the truth. By the time dawn broke through the office windows, he had found it. A series of payments made over 8 months to a supplier called Renwick & Sons, for shipments of imported timber that, according to the estate's own delivery logs, had never actually arrived. The payments were substantial, and they were authorized, according to the signature at the bottom of each entry, by Edmund Marlowe himself, acting on Alistair's behalf during a period when Alistair had been away settling a dispute in the Northern Territories. Alistair sat back in his chair, the candle guttering low beside him, and felt something cold and clear settle into place inside his chest. This was what Alina had found. This was what she had tried to warn him about on the last night he ever truly spoke with her. And instead of listening, instead of trusting his wife's careful eye and honest concern, he had dismissed her completely, sending her out into a storm alone, toward a carriage that someone had quietly, deliberately made unsafe. The guilt that had lived inside him for a year suddenly felt different, sharper, mixed now with something like fury. If his suspicions were correct, someone in his own family had nearly cost him everything he loved, and had very nearly succeeded in getting away with it entirely. He needed proof. He needed to find Mara again, and this time he would not let her run. A shadow moved past the apothecary's back window just as the candles inside were being blown out for the night, and Alistair, who had been waiting across the street for nearly 3 hours in the cold, straightened immediately, every muscle in his body suddenly alert. He had returned to Ashford at first light, determined not to leave until he had spoken with Mara directly, evidence in hand, patience worn thin. He had watched the shop all day from a distance, careful not to alarm the aunt again, and had nearly given up hope when the shape passed the window in the fading evening light. It was slight and quick, unmistakably a woman's figure, and his heart began to pound before he had even confirmed what his eyes were telling him. He crossed the street and moved toward the narrow alley behind the shop, the same alley she had vanished into a week earlier. This time he did not run. He walked slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to see him coming, to run again if she truly wished to, though something in him hoped desperately that she would not. She was standing near a small back door, a basket of empty jars in her hands, and when she looked up and saw him standing at the mouth of the alley, she froze completely. The basket nearly slipped from her fingers. "Please," Alistair said quietly, keeping his voice as gentle and non-threatening as he could manage, though his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. "I only wish to speak with you. I mean you no harm." "I do not know you," the woman said, but her voice shook slightly on the words, and she did not run, though every line of her body looked ready to. "Your aunt told me your name is Mara," Alistair continued, taking one slow step closer. "I do not believe that is entirely true, though I understand why you might have reason to hide." "You are mistaken," she said again, but weaker this time. "Elena," he said softly, and watched her flinch as though the name itself had struck her. "I am not mistaken. I would know your eyes anywhere. I would know the way you hold your chin when you are frightened, but trying not to show it. I have known that expression since the day I first met you at your father's house, when you argued with me about crop rotation before you had even learned my name properly." Her breath caught audibly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The evening around them had gone very quiet, only the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere across the town breaking the stillness. "You should not have come here," she finally said, and her voice, though still guarded, had lost the flat stranger's tone she had used a moment before. It was her voice now, unmistakably, the voice he had fallen asleep listening to for 3 years of marriage, the voice that had whispered his name in the dark on countless quiet nights, the voice that had shouted at him in anger on the last night he saw her. "Elena," he said again, and this time his own voice broke slightly on her name, a year of grief and guilt suddenly rushing to the surface all at once. "I thought you were dead. I have spent a year believing I killed you, that my last words to you sent you into that storm to die. Please tell me I am not imagining this. Tell me it is truly you." She set the basket down slowly on the ground beside her, her hands trembling, and when she looked up at him again, tears had gathered in her eyes, the same green eyes he had painted from memory in his mind 1,000 times over the past year. "It is me," she whispered finally. "But Alistair, you cannot be here, you cannot be seen with me. It is not safe for either of us." "Not safe from what? From whom?" He took another step closer, close enough now to see the small details he had memorized so completely, the faint scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the particular way a strand of dark hair curled against her cheek. "Elena, I have spent a year mourning you. I deserve to know the truth, even if that truth puts me in danger." "Especially if it does." She glanced nervously toward the mouth of the alley, then toward the small windows of the buildings around them, as though expecting eyes to be watching from every shadow. "Not here," she said finally. "If anyone sees us together, if anyone recognizes you and connects it to me, everything I have built to stay hidden collapses in a single moment. Please, if you truly wish to understand, meet me tonight after the town has gone to sleep. There is an old mill on the eastern edge of town, abandoned for years. I will explain everything I can there." Alistair wanted desperately to pull her into his arms right there in the narrow alley, to hold her and confirm with his own hands that she was truly real and not some cruel trick his exhausted mind had conjured. But he saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the careful way she kept glancing over his shoulder, and he understood, with a chill settling into his chest, that her fear was not born of imagination. Someone real and dangerous had made her afraid enough to fake her own death and hide in a small market town for an entire year. "I will be there," he said. "I swear it." She nodded once quickly, and then slipped back through the shop's rear door without another word, leaving Alistair standing alone in the darkening alley, his heart pounding with an emotion he had not felt in so long he had nearly forgotten its shape entirely. It was not quite joy, not yet, not with so much fear and uncertainty tangled around it. But it was something close to hope, fierce and unfamiliar after a year of grief, and it carried him through the long hours until nightfall like a lantern held against the dark. He spent those hours walking the edges of Ashford, keeping himself out of sight, trying to piece together what her fear might mean. If she had faked her own death to escape danger, the danger must have felt severe and immediate. A woman did not simply abandon her title, her home, her husband, and every comfort of her former life unless she believed the alternative was far worse. Alistair thought again of the ledger discrepancy, of Edmund's signature authorizing payments for goods that never arrived, of the mysterious man who had inspected the carriage without being summoned by anyone at the estate. The pieces were beginning to form a shape, and the shape was uglier than he had allowed himself to imagine. When full darkness finally settled over Ashford, Alistair made his way carefully to the eastern edge of town, following a narrow dirt path that led toward the silhouette of an old abandoned mill standing black against the star-filled sky. The building's wooden wheel had long since stopped turning, its structure leaning slightly with age and neglect, but a faint light flickered from a window on the lower floor, and Alistair's pulse quickened at the sight of it. He pushed open the old door carefully, and there, standing in the glow of a single lantern set upon an overturned barrel, was Elena. She had removed her bonnet, and her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders in a way he remembered so vividly it made his chest ache. She turned as he entered, and for a long moment they simply stood there, staring at each other across the dusty, empty space, a year of grief and separation stretching silently between them. "I do not know where to begin," she said finally, her voice small in the vast quiet of the old mill. "Begin with the accident," Alistair said gently, moving slowly closer, giving her space but unable to stay fully away. "Begin with what truly happened on that bridge." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, as though the memory itself brought a physical chill. The wheel broke exactly as everyone believed, but it did not break by accident. I felt the carriage lurch strangely even before we reached the bridge, and Ferris, bless him, fought to keep the horses under control, but something was wrong with the wheel from the very start of the journey. When we reached the bridge, it simply gave way entirely. "I know," Alistair said quietly. "I spoke with Ferris's wife. She told me a stranger inspected the carriage days before, someone dressed too finely to be a stable hand, who was never summoned by anyone I know of." Elena's eyes widened slightly, surprised that he had already uncovered that much on his own. "Then you understand it was no accident." "I am beginning to understand a great many things," Alistair said. "Please, tell me what happened after the carriage went into the river. How did you survive? Why did you never come home to me?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flickering lantern light, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a year spent alone, frightened, and far from everything she had once known. "I do not remember all of it," Elena admitted, her voice unsteady. "The carriage struck the water, and everything after that is broken pieces, fragments that do not fit together properly no matter how many times I try to arrange them. I remember cold water closing over my head. I remember fighting toward what I thought was the surface, though I could not tell which direction was truly up. I remember my dress dragging me down, and I remember thinking, quite calmly, that I was going to die in that river." She paused, wrapping her arms tighter around herself, and Alistair fought the urge to close the distance between them and hold her, sensing she needed to finish the telling before she could accept any comfort. "The next clear memory I have is waking on the riverbank, perhaps a mile downstream, coughing water from my lungs, my whole body aching as though every bone had been struck with a hammer. An old woman found me there. Widow Halloway, a healer who lived alone near the river's edge, gathering herbs and treating the occasional injured traveler for coin. She carried me to her cottage, though I do not know how, given her age and my size, and nursed me through a fever that lasted nearly 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Alistair repeated softly, doing the arithmetic in his mind, realizing that during that time he had been at Marlow Hall, organizing search parties along the riverbank, refusing to accept what everyone around him insisted was already certain. "I did not remember my own name at first," Elena continued. "The fever, or perhaps the blow I took to my head during the accident, had taken pieces of my memory with it. Widow Halloway called me simply Child for the first week, and slowly as the fever broke and my mind began to clear, fragments returned to me. My name, this town, faces I could not yet place." "You—" Her voice caught on the last word, and Alistair took a careful step closer, close enough now to see the tears gathering again in her eyes. "By the time my memory had returned enough to understand who I truly was," she went on, "I also began to remember something else. The ledger, the discrepancy in the accounts I had shown you that you dismissed the night before the accident, and I began to wonder with growing dread whether the carriage had truly failed by chance or whether someone had wanted me gone before I could dig further into what I had found." "Edmund," Alistair said quietly, the name tasting bitter in his mouth. Elena's eyes flickered with surprise, then something like relief that she did not have to be the one to speak the accusation first. "I do not know for certain. I never saw who tampered with the carriage and I have no proof beyond suspicion. But the timing troubled me deeply. I had shown you the discrepancy only days before, and word travels quickly within a household, even matters a wife believes are private between herself and her husband. If Edmund learned that I had discovered the false payments to that timber supplier, and understood I intended to pursue the matter further, he had every reason to want me silenced before I could expose whatever scheme he was running beneath the estate's accounts." "So you decided to disappear," Alistair said, understanding dawning slowly and painfully, "rather than come home and risk being found again." "I was terrified," Elena admitted, her voice breaking properly now. "I did not know who to trust. If someone within the household, someone close enough to the family to arrange a carriage inspection without suspicion, wanted me dead, I could not simply walk back into Marlow Hall and announce that I had survived. I would have been announcing myself as a target all over again, and this time whoever wanted me gone would not fail so narrowly. You could have come to me, Alistair said, his voice raw with a year of accumulated grief and guilt. I would have protected you. I would have believed you, Alina, whatever you told me, no matter how strange it sounded. Would you have? She asked, and there was no cruelty in the question, only genuine uncertainty, born from the memory of the last conversation they had shared before the accident. You dismissed my concerns about the ledger the very night before this happened. You told me the accounts were not my concern, that I was imagining problems where none existed. Forgive me, Alistair, but in that moment, curled beside a stranger's fire with a fever burning through my body and half my memory gone, I could not be certain you would believe me over your own trusted cousin. The words struck Alistair harder than any blow could have because they were true, and because he had spent a year already understanding, in his private, guilty moments, exactly how badly he had failed her that night. You are right to have doubted me, he said quietly, forcing himself to accept the full weight of it. I failed you terribly that night, and I have paid for it every single day since, believing I had sent you to your death with careless, cruel words. I cannot ask you to forgive that so easily, but I am asking you to trust me now when it matters most. Let me help you. Let me find proof of what Edmund has done, and let me bring you home safely where you belong. Alina studied his face for a long moment in the flickering lantern light, searching for something, and whatever she found there seemed to ease some of the tension held tight in her shoulders. There is more you should know, she said finally. Something that happened only a few weeks ago, something that has made me more afraid than I have been since the night of the accident itself. Alistair's stomach tightened. Tell me. A man came through Ashford asking questions, Alina said, her voice dropping lower, as though even here in the abandoned mill she feared being overheard. He did not know my current name, of course, but he was asking about a woman matching my description, someone who might have survived a carriage accident near Ashcombe Pass roughly a year ago. My aunt, Widow Halloway's cousin, who has sheltered me since my memory returned, managed to turn him away with a convincing enough denial, but it frightened me terribly. Someone knows, or at least suspects, that I might still be alive. Someone is looking. Do you know who sent him? No, Alina admitted, but it cannot be coincidence that such questions began circulating so soon before you yourself appeared in the market square. Either someone is hunting me directly, or word has somehow reached whoever arranged the accident that their plan may have failed. Alistair felt cold fury settle beneath his ribs, sharper and colder than the guilt that had lived there for the past year. Someone had tried once to kill his wife, and now apparently someone was searching again to finish what they had started. Then we cannot wait, he said firmly. We must find proof against Edmund before he learns you are alive, if he does not know already. If he searches for you directly and succeeds where his first attempt failed, I will not survive losing you a second time, Alina. I could not bear it. And if you gather proof and confront him, what then? Alina asked, fear plain in her voice now. A man capable of arranging a murder to protect his secrets will not simply confess and accept whatever punishment the law demands. He will fight to protect himself by whatever means necessary. You would be placing yourself in as much danger as I already carry. Then we will be careful, Alistair said, but we will not simply wait and hope he never finds you. I refuse to spend another year like the last, grieving a wife who is not truly gone, while the man responsible walks freely through my own halls, sharing meals at my own table. I would rather face the danger directly than continue living inside that lie. Alina was quiet for a long moment, and then, slowly, she crossed the remaining distance between them and allowed him to pull her into his arms for the first time in over a year. Alistair held her carefully, as though she might dissolve like mist if he gripped too tightly, and felt something in his chest that had been frozen solid for 12 long months finally begin, however cautiously, to thaw. We must be very careful, Alina whispered against his shoulder. If Edmund discovers I am alive before we have proof strong enough to expose him publicly, he will not hesitate to try again, and next time he may not fail. I understand, Alistair said quietly, holding her closer. We will move carefully and quietly until we have everything we need. I promise you, Alina. I will not lose you a second time. Outside the old mill, the night wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the ancient structure, and somewhere in the darkness beyond, unseen by either of them, a figure watched the flickering lantern light from a distance, before turning quietly and disappearing back toward the road that led to Marlow Hall. Smoke curled from the chimney of a small cottage on the far edge of Marlow Land 3 nights later, and inside, Edmund Marlowe sat by the fire listening carefully to the report of the man he had sent to Ashford weeks earlier. "You are certain it was the Duke you saw meeting her?" Edmund asked, his voice deceptively calm, though his fingers tightened around the arm of his chair. "Certain, sir," the man answered, twisting his cap nervously in his hands. "Followed him from the old mill myself. Kept my distance, but there's no mistaking the Duke's own horse, nor the woman he met inside. Dark hair, same build as was described to me. She's been living in that town near a year, going by the name Mara, working in an apothecary shop." Edmund's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring into the fire as though it might offer him a solution to the problem that had just been placed, unwelcome, into his lap. A year of careful work, a year of quietly managing the estate's finances in his cousin's grief-stricken absence, siphoning funds through false timber contracts, while Alistair remained too devastated to examine the ledgers closely, all of it now threatened by a woman who should have drowned in that river 12 months ago. "You will say nothing of this to anyone," Edmund said finally. "Do you understand me? Nothing." "Of course, sir," the man said quickly. "Good, you have served me well. There will be more coin for your trouble." Edmund reached into his coat and withdrew a small purse, tossing it toward the man without looking at him directly. His mind was already elsewhere, already working through the problem with the same cold efficiency he had used to arrange the accident 12 months earlier. If Alina was alive, and if Alistair had already found her, then the careful fiction Edmund had built over the past year, the grieving Duke too broken to examine his own accounts too closely, was about to collapse entirely. He would need to act quickly, and this time, he resolved, there would be no mistakes left to chance. Unaware of the danger drawing closer, Alistair spent the following days working methodically alongside Nathaniel Cole, the only member of the household staff he had chosen to trust with a portion of the truth. He told Nathaniel only that he suspected fraud within the estate accounts, and asked for his help gathering evidence discreetly, without revealing yet that Alina had survived. It was not that he doubted Nathaniel's loyalty, earned over 20 faithful years of service, but rather that he could not risk word reaching Edmund through even the most innocent slip of conversation among the staff. Together, they traced the false payments to Renwick and Sons back through years of records, discovering that the supposed timber company existed only on paper, registered to an address that, upon careful investigation, turned out to be a small rented room above a tavern in a town 2 days' ride from Marlowe Hall, paid for monthly by a solicitor who, Nathaniel eventually confirmed through careful questioning, had also handled certain private matters for Edmund Marlowe personally. "This is enough to raise serious questions," Nathaniel said one evening, reviewing the collected documents spread across the estate office desk. "But questions alone will not be enough to convict a man of your cousin's standing, Your Grace. He will claim ignorance, blame a dishonest solicitor, and the matter may end there, with Edmund walking free and simply more careful in the future." "I am aware," Alistair said grimly. "We need something more direct, a confession or a witness willing to speak plainly against him." "There may be one possibility," Nathaniel said slowly. "The solicitor himself, a man named Grigsby, has a reputation for loose morals when it comes to loyalty. If approached correctly with the right combination of pressure and incentive, he might be persuaded to speak honestly about who truly authorized these payments and why." Alistair considered this carefully. Confronting Grigsby directly carried its own risks, particularly if the solicitor chose to warn Edmund rather than cooperate. But it seemed the most promising path forward, and time, Alistair felt with growing certainty, was not something they possessed in unlimited supply. Meanwhile, in Ashford, Alina's days had grown increasingly tense. Her aunt, the woman who ran the apothecary shop and who Alistair now understood to be a distant relation of Widow Halloway rather than truly family by blood, had grown visibly anxious since the night Alistair first appeared asking questions. She watched the street outside more carefully now, startled at unfamiliar faces passing the shop window, and had twice suggested to Alina that perhaps it was time to move further from Ashford entirely, to somewhere even the Duke could not easily find her. "I cannot keep running forever," Alina told her one evening as they closed the shop for the night, drawing the curtains carefully across the front windows. "If Edmund already suspects I am alive, moving to another town will not protect me for long. Alistair believes we can gather enough evidence to expose him properly and end this danger for good." "And if he cannot?" her aunt asked, her weathered face creased with worry. "If your Duke fails," and Edmund learns exactly where you are hiding before the proof is ready. Elena did not have a good answer for that question, and the uncertainty of it kept her awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling of the small room above the shop that had been her home for the past year, wondering whether trusting Alistair again, opening herself back up to hope after so long spent guarding against it, had been wise or simply reckless. Her fears were not unfounded. 3 days after Edmund learned of her survival, a stranger appeared in Ashford's market square, asking careful, casual questions at various stalls about the apothecary shop and its owners, claiming to be an old family friend hoping to reconnect. The baker who sold bread near the apothecary grew suspicious of the man's manner, the way his questions circled too precisely around Mara specifically rather than the shop in general, and mentioned it to Elena's aunt that same afternoon out of simple, neighborly concern. Elena's blood ran cold when she heard the description. Tall, well-dressed, careful and polite in manner but with eyes that did not match the warmth of his voice. It matched no one she could place directly, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was closing in. She sent word to Alistair immediately through Nathaniel, who had established a discreet means of passing messages between Marlow Hall and Ashford without drawing attention. Alistair received the warning that same evening, and felt real fear grip his chest for the first time since this entire ordeal began. Fear not for himself, but for Elena, alone in that small town with only an aging aunt for protection against a man who had already proven himself willing to kill. "We cannot wait for Grigsby's confession any longer," Alistair told Nathaniel that night, pacing the length of his study with restless, urgent energy. "Edmund is closing in on her. I must move her somewhere safer immediately, and we must accelerate our investigation, whatever the risk." "Bringing her to Marlow Hall directly would be dangerous," Nathaniel cautioned. "If Edmund sees her there, sees the game has ended, there is no predicting what he might attempt, especially if he feels cornered with nothing left to lose." "Then we hide her somewhere he would never think to look," Alistair said, an idea forming even as he spoke the words aloud. "My mother's sister, Lady Winslow, lives 3 days' ride from here, on an estate with no connection to Edmund whatsoever. Elena could stay there under a false name, protected, while we finish gathering the evidence we need." It was a reasonable plan, careful and cautious, and Nathaniel agreed to help arrange it discreetly the following morning. But that night, before any arrangements could be made, before any message could reach Ashford with instructions for Elena to prepare for a sudden journey, something happened that shattered whatever fragile safety remained. A fire broke out at Quinn's Remedies just after midnight. Elena woke coughing, smoke already thick in the small room above the shop, orange light flickering wildly beneath her door. She grabbed her aunt, shaking her awake with desperate urgency, and together they fled down the back stairs, through the rear door, out into the cold night air, coughing and terrified as flames consumed the shop that had been Elena's refuge and hiding place for an entire year. Neighbors gathered quickly, forming a bucket line from the town well, and eventually the fire was contained before it could spread to the buildings on either side. Though Quinn's Remedies itself was gutted almost completely by morning, nothing left but blackened timber and the acrid smell of smoke hanging heavy over that section of the market square. Elena stood in the street, wrapped in a borrowed blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, staring at the smoking ruin of the shop, her mind reeling with a single terrifying certainty. This had been no accident. The fire had started at the rear of the shop near the back door, precisely where someone attempting to trap the occupants inside might choose to begin such a blaze. Someone had tried to kill her again, and this time they had come dangerously, terrifyingly close to succeeding. Word of the fire reached Marlow Hall before dawn, carried by a breathless messenger boy Nathaniel had stationed in Ashford precisely for such emergencies. Alistair was already dressed and mounted before the boy had finished speaking, riding out into the grey early morning light with a terror clawing at his chest, unlike anything he had felt even on the night of the original accident. He reached Ashford within the hour, his horse lathered with sweat, and found the market square still smelling of smoke. Small groups of townspeople gathered around the ruined shell of Quinn's Remedies, murmuring among themselves about the strange fire that had broken out with no clear cause. He searched frantically through the crowd until he found her, standing near the town well with her aunt, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, her face pale with shock but otherwise unharmed. "Elena," he breathed, relief crashing through him so powerfully his knees nearly buckled. He crossed the square quickly and pulled her into his arms, uncaring now of who might see them together, all caution abandoned in the face of how close he had come to losing her a second time. "I am unharmed," she said quietly against his shoulder, though her voice trembled. "But Alistair, this was no accident. The fire began at the back door, exactly where someone would start it if they wished to trap us inside." "I know," Alistair said grimly, pulling back to look at her properly, checking for any injury his eyes might have missed. "This ends today. I will not risk your life a single day longer while we wait for careful evidence. You are coming with me now to my aunt's estate, where you will be properly protected until this is finished." Alina did not argue. The night's terror had stripped away whatever remaining hesitation she carried about trusting him fully again, and within the hour, with her aunt's blessing and a small bag of hastily gathered belongings, she was mounted behind Alistair on his horse, riding away from Ashford and the burned remains of the only refuge she had known for the past year. They traveled hard for the better part of 2 days, taking careful, indirect routes to avoid drawing attention, stopping only when absolutely necessary, and by the evening of the second day they reached Lady Winslow's estate, a comfortable manor house set well back from the main road, surrounded by tall hedges and a discreet, trustworthy staff. Alistair's aunt, a sharp-eyed widow who asked few questions and demanded even fewer explanations, welcomed Alina warmly once Alistair had explained enough of the situation to secure her full cooperation and silence. "She will be safe here," Lady Winslow assured her nephew, watching Alina settle nervously into the guest room prepared for her. "No one connects this house to Marlowe affairs. You have my word she will want for nothing, and no visitor will learn her true identity from my staff." With Alina finally settled somewhere Alistair believed genuinely safe, he allowed himself, for the first time in days, to focus fully on the second half of the problem that remained. Edmund had to be exposed, and exposed thoroughly enough that no amount of charm or clever excuse could save him from the consequences of what he had done. Alistair returned to Marlowe Hall and summoned Nathaniel immediately, laying out everything that had happened in Ashford, the fire, the certainty now that Edmund knew Alina lived and had already made a second attempt on her life. Nathaniel's expression darkened with each detail. "Then we cannot afford further delay," Nathaniel said. "I will go to Grigsby myself tonight if necessary. A man who arranges fires to silence witnesses is not a man who will hesitate to silence anyone else standing in his way, including a solicitor who knows too much and might grow nervous enough to talk." The journey to the town where Grigsby kept his office took the better part of a day, and Nathaniel arrived to find the solicitor in a state of visible agitation, pacing his small office, papers scattered across his desk as though he had been searching frantically through his own records. When Nathaniel introduced himself as representing the Duke of Marlowe's interests, Grigsby's already pale face went nearly white. "I want no part of whatever trouble is coming," Grigsby said quickly, before Nathaniel had even finished stating his purpose. "I have heard rumors these past 2 days, whispers that something has gone badly wrong with certain arrangements. I have kept careful records of everything, every payment, every instruction, precisely because I suspected a day like this might eventually arrive." "Then you will cooperate," Nathaniel said carefully, watching the man's nervous energy with cautious hope. "I will do more than cooperate," Grigsby said, lowering his voice despite being entirely alone in his office. "I will hand over every document, every letter bearing Edmund Marlowe's own signature, instructing me to establish a false timber company and process payments that no goods ever backed. I did not know when I first agreed to the arrangement that it involved anything beyond simple financial fraud. Had I known a woman's life hung in the balance, I would never have agreed to any part of it. But I have grown afraid these past weeks, afraid of what a man capable of such things might do to a solicitor who knows too many of his secrets, should he decide I have become inconvenient." Grigsby spent the following hours gathering every relevant document from his files, and by the time Nathaniel rode back toward Marlowe Hall the next morning, he carried with him a leather satchel containing enough evidence to leave no reasonable doubt of Edmund's guilt, letters bearing his signature, detailed instructions for the false payments, and most damning of all, a letter written only weeks earlier, in which Edmund referenced, in carefully coded but unmistakable language. The need to ensure a certain matter from a year ago remained permanently settled, given troubling rumors that had recently reached his ears. Alistair read through the documents late into the night, his hands steady now with cold, focused purpose rather than the wild grief and confusion that had ruled him for the past year. Every piece fit precisely into place. Edmund had stolen substantial sums from the estate through the false timber contracts. Alina had discovered the fraud and threatened, however unknowingly, to expose it, and Edmund had responded by arranging an accident designed to look like nothing more than tragic misfortune. When word reached him that Alina had somehow survived, he had moved quickly and ruthlessly to finish what the original accident had failed to accomplish. "We have enough," Alistair said finally, setting the last document down on his desk. "Enough to bring this before the proper authorities, enough to see Edmund answer fully for what he has done." "There remains the question of how to proceed," Nathaniel said carefully. "Edmund is family, respected within certain circles, and a man cornered may act unpredictably. If he learns we possess this evidence before we can act on it properly, he may attempt to flee entirely, or worse, attempt some final, desperate act against either yourself or the Duchess." Alistair considered this carefully, turning the problem over in his mind with the same methodical patience he had once applied to rebuilding the estate's finances after his father's careless years. A public confrontation carried real risk, but a quiet arrest, arranged without warning, offered the best chance of ensuring Edmund could not act rashly before justice could properly be served. "There is to be a gathering at Marlow Hall in 3 days' time," Alistair said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "My mother has been planning it for weeks, a formal dinner to mark the anniversary of my father's passing, with several members of the extended family invited, Edmund among them. If we act during that gathering, with the proper authorities present and ready, we can ensure Edmund is confronted publicly, before witnesses, with no opportunity to flee or cause further harm before the truth is fully exposed." "And the Duchess?" Nathaniel asked carefully. "Would you bring her back to Marlow Hall for such an occasion?" Alistair was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risk against what felt, suddenly and powerfully, like the right and necessary course. Alina had spent a full year hiding, afraid, robbed of her name, her home, and her rightful place beside him. If this plan succeeded, if Edmund was exposed properly and permanently before the eyes of the entire family, there would be no better moment for Alina to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her, publicly and completely, in the very halls where she once belonged. "Yes," Alistair said finally, his voice steady with resolve. "She will be there, not hidden away, not disguised, but standing as exactly who she truly is, the Duchess of Marlow, returned at last. If Edmund is to be exposed before the family, then Alina deserves to reclaim her name in that very same moment, before the same witnesses who once believed her lost forever." Nathaniel nodded slowly, understanding the weight and the risk of what Alistair proposed, but also recognizing something else in his master's expression that had been absent for a full year of grief, a fierce, determined hope that would not be denied any longer. "Then we have 3 days to prepare everything properly," Nathaniel said. "The authorities must be arranged discreetly, the evidence organized clearly, and the Duchess brought safely back from Lady Winslow's estate, without alerting anyone along the way who might carry word to Edmund before the appointed evening." 3 days, Alistair repeated, looking out through the study window toward the dark grounds of Marlow Hall, thinking of Alina safely tucked away at his aunt's estate, thinking of the ruined apothecary shop in Ashford, thinking of a year of grief that was finally, painfully, giving way to something that might yet become justice, and perhaps, if fortune allowed it, something that might even become happiness once again. He sent word to Lady Winslow's estate that same night, carefully worded to avoid revealing anything should the message somehow fall into the wrong hands, asking only that Alina prepare herself for a journey home in 3 days' time, and trust that everything necessary had finally been set properly into motion. A carriage wheel creaked loudly on the uneven road, and Alina flinched so hard at the sound that Alistair reached across the seat and took her hand without thinking, steadying her before she even realized how visibly she had reacted. "It is only the road," he said gently. "This carriage has been inspected 3 times over by Nathaniel himself. You are safe." "I know," Alina said, though her fingers remained tight around his. "I do not think that fear will leave me easily, no matter how many times I remind myself of it logically." They were 2 days into the journey back from Lady Winslow's estate, traveling carefully and by indirect roads, staying at quiet inns along the way rather than announcing their presence at any grand establishment where word might travel quickly back toward Marlow lands. It was the first extended time they had spent together since the night at the old mill, and Alistair found himself grateful for it. despite the danger and uncertainty hanging over every mile of the journey, because it gave them space to speak honestly about matters that had gone unspoken for far too long. I have thought a great deal these past days about that final conversation we had before the accident, Alistair said carefully as the carriage rolled steadily along the quiet road. About the ledger and how I dismissed your concerns so completely. I have turned it over in my mind 1,000 times this past year, wondering if I had simply listened, simply trusted your judgment as I should have from the very start, whether any of this suffering could have been avoided entirely. Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the passing countryside through the carriage window. I have thought of it as well, she admitted. In truth, I was harsher with you that night than perhaps I needed to be. I had grown frustrated, feeling that my opinions on estate matters were never taken as seriously as they deserved, simply because I was your wife rather than your steward or solicitor. That frustration had been building for months before that particular evening, and I let it all spill out at once, in anger, rather than approaching you calmly. You had every right to be frustrated, Alistair said firmly. I dismissed you not because your concerns lacked merit, but because my own pride could not easily accept correction, particularly regarding matters I considered entirely within my own domain. It was a foolish, dangerous kind of pride, and it very nearly cost me everything that mattered most to me in this world. We were both proud, Elena said, a faint sad smile touching her lips for the first time since the fire. Perhaps that is simply the nature of two strong-willed people trying to build a life together. We will disagree, Alistair, many times over the years if we are fortunate enough to have those years together. What matters, I think, is that we learn to disagree without dismissing one another so completely, without ever again allowing pride to stand between us during a moment that truly matters. I promise you that, Alistair said, meaning it with every part of himself. Whatever comes after these next few days, whatever danger we must still face together, I promise you I will never again dismiss your judgment so carelessly. You were right about the ledger. You were right to be concerned. I should have listened from the very first moment you brought it to me. Elena squeezed his hand gently, and for a long, comfortable moment, neither of them spoke further, simply sitting together in the quiet rocking of the carriage, two people who had lost each other completely and found their way back through grief, fear, and finally cautious hope. As the journey continued, Alistair explained in careful detail the plan for the gathering at Marlow Hall, the presence of the authorities arranged discreetly through a magistrate Nathaniel trusted completely, the evidence gathered from Grigsby's records, and the moment when Elena would step forward, alive and unmistakable, before the eyes of the assembled family. Are you certain this is wise? Elena asked, worry creasing her brow. A public reveal before the entire family with Edmund himself present. If he panics, if he feels cornered with nothing left to lose, there is no predicting what he might attempt, even surrounded by witnesses. The magistrate will have men positioned discreetly throughout the house, Alistair assured her. Nathaniel has arranged everything with great care. Edmund will have no opportunity to flee, and no opportunity to cause harm before the truth is fully and publicly established. I understand the risk, Elena, believe me, I have considered it from every angle these past 3 days, but I also believe this is the surest path to ending the danger permanently. A quiet arrest carries its own risks, allows Edmund room to construct excuses, to claim innocence through clever lawyers and family influence. A public exposure, before witnesses who cannot later be persuaded to doubt what they saw with their own eyes, leaves him nowhere left to hide. Elena considered this for a long moment, and then nodded slowly. Then I trust your judgment in this, as you once should have trusted mine. Let us finish this properly together, and reclaim what is rightfully ours. They arrived at Marlow Hall late on the evening before the gathering, under cover of darkness. Elena kept carefully out of sight in a guest wing far from the main household, attended only by servants Nathaniel had personally vetted for absolute discretion. The Dowager Duchess Constance, informed only that afternoon of the full truth by her son, wept with a mixture of joy and shock so profound that Alistair worried briefly for her health, before she gathered herself and embraced the plan with the same fierce protectiveness she had shown her son throughout the entire ordeal of the past year. That wretched boy, Constance said of Edmund, her voice trembling with a fury Alistair had rarely witnessed in his composed mother. I welcomed him into this house countless times, trusted him with matters of the estate during your grief, and all the while he sat across my table plotting to finish what he had started. He will answer for this, Alistair, whatever it costs the family's reputation. I will not shield him from justice for the sake of appearances. The final day before the gathering passed in careful, quiet preparation. The magistrate arrived discreetly that afternoon, disguised as an invited guest, accompanied by 2 trusted constables who would remain hidden among the household staff until the appointed moment. Nathaniel reviewed every document one final time, ensuring nothing had been overlooked, while Alina, alone in her guest chamber, prepared herself for the evening that would determine not only her own future, but the fate of the man who had nearly succeeded in ending her life twice over. She stood before a mirror that evening, dressed in a gown Constance had provided, deep blue silk, that suited her far better than the plain gray dresses she had worn throughout her year of hiding, and studied her own reflection with an unfamiliar mixture of fear and determination. "You look every inch the Duchess you always were," Constance said softly, entering the room and standing beside her at the mirror. "Whatever fear you carry tonight, my dear, remember that you have already survived the very worst that man could throw at you. Tonight, you simply finish what he started on your own terms, before witnesses who will finally know the full truth of your courage." Alina turned to the older woman, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me so quickly, for trusting this plan without hesitation." "You are my son's wife," Constance said simply, taking Alina's hands in her own weathered ones. "And from what I have heard of your courage this past year, surviving alone, protecting yourself and building a new life from nothing while carrying such terrible fear, I believe you are far stronger than most people in this family ever gave you proper credit for. Tonight, the entire household will finally see that strength for themselves." Downstairs, the sound of arriving carriages began drifting up through the old halls of Marlow Hall, family members and invited guests gathering for what they believed would be a solemn but ordinary dinner marking the anniversary of the late Duke's passing. None of them, save for Alastair, Constance, and Nathaniel, had any notion of the truth that waited to be revealed before the evening concluded, and somewhere among the gathering guests, Edmund Marlow arrived as well, smiling easily, greeting relatives with his familiar practiced charm, entirely unaware that the careful lies he had built over the past year were about to collapse completely around him. Candlelight filled the great dining hall of Marlow Hall, reflecting off polished silver and crystal glasses, while nearly 30 members of the extended family and close family friends took their seats around the long table, their quiet conversation filling the room with the comfortable murmur of an ordinary formal dinner. Edmund Marlow sat near the center of the table, engaged in pleasant conversation with an elderly aunt, entirely at ease, his wine glass catching the candlelight as he laughed at something she had said. Alastair sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully composed despite the storm of nerves churning beneath the surface. He caught Nathaniel's eye across the room, receiving a small, nearly imperceptible nod, confirming that the magistrate and his men were positioned exactly where they needed to be, blending quietly among the household staff serving the meal. The first course was cleared, and Alastair rose slowly from his seat, tapping his glass gently to draw the room's attention. Conversation faded gradually into curious silence as every face turned toward him. "Before we continue this evening," Alastair began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I find myself needing to share something with this family, something that has weighed heavily upon me for the entirety of the past year, and something that I believe every person in this room deserves to hear directly from me." A murmur of concerned curiosity moved through the gathered guests. Constance sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching her son with fierce, protective attention. Edmund's easy smile faltered slightly, though he covered it quickly with a curious, sympathetic expression that Alastair recognized now, with cold clarity, as nothing more than practiced performance. "A year ago," Alastair continued, "we all believed my wife Alina perished in a tragic accident on Ashcombe Bridge. I have spent every day since that night believing the same terrible truth, mourning her loss, blaming myself for the argument that sent her out into that storm. I have carried that grief and that guilt every single day for 12 long months." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the silent room, watching carefully as several faces around the table shifted with confused sympathy, unsure why he was raising such painful history now, at what was meant to be a solemn but forward-looking family gathering. "But I have recently learned," Alastair continued, his voice growing firmer, "that the accident on Ashcombe Bridge was no accident at all. The carriage wheel that failed that night had been deliberately sabotaged, by someone within this very family, someone who stood to gain significantly from my wife's death, and who has continued, even in these recent weeks, to protect that terrible secret through further acts of violence. The room erupted into startled murmurs, several guests exchanging alarmed glances, and Edmund's face had gone noticeably pale, though he forced a laugh that came out thin and unconvincing. "Alistair, surely grief has led you toward some troubling misunderstanding," Edmund said, his voice carrying a forced lightness that did not match the tension visible in his shoulders. "What possible evidence could support such an extraordinary claim?" "A great deal of evidence, actually," Alistair said, turning his gaze directly toward his cousin for the first time since beginning to speak. "Evidence gathered from a solicitor named Grigsby, who has provided documentation of false timber contracts authorized under your signature, Edmund, contracts used to steal significant sums from this estate over the course of nearly 2 years. Evidence from Ferris's widow, describing a stranger who inspected the carriage days before the accident, a stranger dressed too finely for a stable hand. And most recently, evidence from a fire set deliberately at an apothecary shop in Ashford, an attempt to finish what that carriage accident failed to accomplish a year earlier." Edmund's composure was cracking visibly now, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his eyes darting toward the door as though calculating the distance and the odds of reaching it. "This is madness," Edmund said, his voice rising with genuine panic beneath the forced indignation. "You would accuse family, based on the ravings of a dishonest solicitor and the confused memory of a grieving widow. I have served this estate faithfully throughout your grief, Alistair, managed your affairs when you were too broken to attend to them yourself, and this is the gratitude I receive." "You served this estate by stealing from it," Alistair said, his voice cold and unwavering now, "and by arranging the murder of my wife when she discovered your theft and threatened, however innocently, to expose it. And when you learned weeks ago that she had somehow survived, you tried to finish the task a second time, setting fire to the shop where she had been hiding for the past year." "Lies," Edmund said, though his voice had grown weak and unconvincing, the panic in his eyes visible now to everyone at the table. "Elena is dead. Everyone in this room knows that terrible truth." "Is she?" Alistair asked quietly, and turned toward the door at the far end of the dining hall, where Nathaniel now stood, having quietly signaled toward the corridor beyond. The door opened slowly, and every head at the table turned as Elena stepped into the room, dressed in the deep blue silk gown Constance had provided, her chin held high despite the visible tremor in her hands, her green eyes fixed steadily on Edmund from across the length of the dining hall. The room fell into stunned, absolute silence. Several guests gasped audibly, others simply stared in disbelieving shock, and an elderly aunt near the center of the table pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Constance rose slowly from her seat, tears streaming openly down her face, though she did not move from her place, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as her son had planned it. Edmund stared at Elena as though looking upon a ghost, his face draining of every remaining trace of color, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound at all. Whatever careful denials he had prepared, whatever excuses he had rehearsed in his mind for this exact confrontation, none of it seemed sufficient in the face of the living, breathing proof standing directly before him. "You," Edmund finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt, carrying clearly across the silent room. "I survived the river, Edmund, though not without cost. I lost pieces of my memory, months of my life spent recovering in hiding, terrified to return home because I did not know who among this family I could truly trust. And when word reached you that I might still be alive, you sent someone to burn down the only refuge I had built for myself, hoping to finish what you started on that bridge a year ago." "I never meant for anyone to die," Edmund said suddenly, the words tumbling out of him in a rush, as though the weight of a year's careful lies had finally become too heavy to carry a moment longer. "The payments, yes, I confess to that. I needed the funds desperately, debts I dared not reveal to this family, gambling debts that threatened to ruin the Marlowe name entirely if they became known. But I never intended for the carriage to kill anyone. The man I hired was only meant to weaken the wheel enough to delay the journey, to buy me time to correct the ledgers before Elena could show them properly to Alistair. I never imagined the accident would prove so severe." "And the fire?" Alistair demanded, his voice shaking now with barely controlled fury. "Was that also merely meant to delay, Edmund, or did you finally intend, quite deliberately, to finish what the accident began?" Edmund said nothing, his silence answering the question more completely than any words could have managed. He sank slowly back into his chair, all pretense of innocence finally abandoned, staring down at the table before him as the full weight of exposure settled over him completely. The magistrate stepped forward from among the staff at that moment, revealing his true role to the shocked assembly, flanked by the two constables who had remained hidden throughout the evening. "Edmund Marlowe," the magistrate said formally, "you are under arrest on charges of fraud, attempted murder, and arson, based on evidence gathered and presented before witnesses this evening." Edmund did not resist as the constables moved to secure him, his earlier panic having collapsed into a hollow, defeated silence. As he was led from the dining hall, past the shocked and murmuring gathering of family members, he paused only once, looking back toward Alistair and Alina standing together near the head of the table. "I only wanted what I believed I deserved," Edmund said quietly, though no one in the room felt any sympathy remaining for those final, bitter words. "The title, the estate, everything that should have been mine had circumstances been only slightly different." "You wanted what was never yours to take," Alistair said firmly, "and you were willing to destroy an innocent woman's life to claim it. Whatever debts drove you to this, Edmund, they do not excuse what you have done." The constables led Edmund away, and slowly the shocked silence of the dining hall began to break apart into a rising wave of astonished conversation. Family members turning toward Alina with expressions ranging from disbelief to overwhelming joy, several rising from their seats to approach her directly, reaching for her hands, embracing her with tears streaming freely now across many faces throughout the room. Alistair crossed the short distance to stand beside Alina, taking her hand firmly in his own before the assembled family, and for the first time in over a year, allowed himself to smile fully and openly, without the shadow of grief and guilt that had darkened every expression he had worn since the night of the accident. "Welcome home," he said quietly just for her, though his voice carried enough warmth that everyone nearby could hear the depth of feeling behind those simple words. "Welcome home, Alina, Duchess of Marlowe." Alina smiled back at him through her own gathering tears, squeezing his hand tightly, and for the first time in an entire long, frightening year, allowed herself to fully believe that the nightmare had finally, truly ended. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of Marlowe Hall on a bright spring morning, 6 months after that unforgettable dinner, and Alina stood in the estate office reviewing the very same ledgers that had once nearly cost her everything, though now she reviewed them freely, openly, seated beside Alistair rather than dismissed from the conversation entirely. The trial of Edmund Marlowe had concluded 3 months earlier, the evidence gathered by Nathaniel and Grigsby proving overwhelming and undeniable before the court. Edmund had been convicted on all charges, stripped permanently of any claim to the Marlowe title or estate, and sentenced to transportation, removing him entirely and permanently from any position where he might threaten the family again. The scandal had rippled through the wider social circles for several weeks, as such scandals always do, but Marlowe Hall itself had settled quickly back into a steady, contented rhythm, strengthened rather than weakened by the truth finally brought fully into the light. Alina had needed time to heal, not only from the physical exhaustion of her year in hiding, but from the deeper wounds left by so many months of fear and isolation. She still occasionally flinched at loud sounds, still sometimes woke in the night with her heart racing from dreams of cold river water closing over her head, but each month brought fewer such moments, and Alistair had learned patience alongside her, understanding that some wounds required careful time rather than simple willpower to fully mend. Widow Halloway, the healer who had first found Alina on the riverbank and nursed her back from the edge of death, had been invited to Marlowe Hall not long after the trial concluded, and had accepted a comfortable position overseeing the estate's small infirmary, close enough that Alina could visit her regularly, grateful beyond words for the woman who had saved her life, when she had nothing left to offer in return but gratitude. Alina's aunt from Ashford, whose careful lies had protected her identity for so many crucial months, had also been welcomed warmly into the extended Marlowe household, given a comfortable cottage on the estate grounds where she continued practicing her herbal remedies for the tenant families, her small apothecary skills now serving the very household that had once nearly discovered her secret. Constance, the Dowager Duchess, had transformed in the months since Alina's return, her earlier anxious worry replaced by a warm, steady joy that seemed to grow more pronounced with each passing week. She and Alina had grown remarkably close during that time, bonded by the shared ordeal of nearly losing someone they both loved so deeply, and Constance had taken to including Alina directly in estate matters that had previously been considered solely a husband's domain, insisting firmly that any woman with the sharp eye to spot fraudulent ledger entries deserved a proper voice in how the estate's affairs were managed going forward. Nathaniel Cole, whose quiet loyalty and careful investigation had proven so essential throughout the entire ordeal, received a substantial increase to his position and responsibilities within the household, though he insisted, with characteristic modesty, that he had only done what any devoted servant of the family would have done in his position. Alastair knew better, and made certain Nathaniel understood exactly how deeply his contribution was valued, both through words and through the material comfort now afforded to him and his own family. As for Alastair himself, the past 6 months had brought a transformation as significant as any experienced by the rest of the household. The guilt that had nearly consumed him during that long year of believed widowhood had not vanished entirely. Some scars simply do not disappear completely, but it had settled into something quieter, something he had learned to carry without letting it control every waking moment. He had become, if anything, a more careful and attentive husband than he had been before the accident, listening fully whenever Alina raised a concern, no matter how small, remembering always the terrible cost of the one time he had failed to listen properly. "You are staring at me again," Alina said one afternoon, glancing up from the ledger before her to find Alastair watching her with quiet, contented affection, rather than reviewing the documents spread across his own side of the desk. "I find I cannot quite help myself," Alastair admitted, a small smile touching his lips. "I spent an entire year believing I would never see you again, Alina. I do not think that particular gratitude will ever fully fade, no matter how many months pass." Alina reached across the desk and took his hand gently, the same easy affection that had once defined their early marriage, now deepened and strengthened by everything they had survived together. "Nor mine," she said softly, "though I hope in time we might spend rather less of our conversation dwelling on what we survived and rather more building what comes next." "What comes next?" Alastair repeated thoughtfully, turning the phrase over with evident pleasure. "I rather like the sound of that." That evening, as the household gathered for a quiet family dinner, considerably smaller and more comfortable than the dramatic gathering that had exposed Edmund's crimes 6 months earlier, Alina announced, with a mixture of nervous excitement and quiet joy, news that brought fresh tears to Constance's eyes and a look of stunned, overwhelming happiness to Alastair's face. A child was expected by early winter, the first heir to carry the Marlowe name into a new generation, born not from tragedy and secrecy, but from a marriage that had been tested nearly beyond endurance and had emerged, against every terrible odds, stronger and more honest than it had ever been before. Word traveled quickly through Ashford as well, in the way such news always does in small market towns, and the following spring, when Alina traveled back to visit the town that had sheltered her through her darkest year, she found the market square rebuilt and thriving, the burned shell of the old apothecary replaced by a new building, funded generously by the Marlowe estate, where her aunt continued her work helping the town's residents with the same quiet dedication she had once shown a frightened, memory-broken young woman found nearly drowned on a riverbank. Standing in that rebuilt market square, her young daughter held carefully in her arms, Alina looked around at the ordinary bustle of a market day, merchants calling their prices, children running between the stalls, the same simple rhythm of life that had once provided her only comfort during a year spent hiding from everyone she loved. She thought of how far she had traveled since that frightened, nameless woman first opened her eyes on Widow Halloway's riverbank, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, a complete and settled peace. Alastair found her there a moment later, having finished his own business with the local magistrate regarding the continued reconstruction efforts throughout Ashford, and slipped his arm around her shoulders, looking down at their small daughter with the same fierce, protective love he had once carried for Alina alone, now multiplied and extended to this new small life they had brought into a world finally free of the danger that had once threatened to destroy everything they held dear. "Do you ever think of that day," Alastair asked quietly, "when I first saw you standing across this very square and could not believe my own eyes?" "Often," Alina admitted, smiling up at him. "I think of how terrified I was in that moment, certain my careful hiding had finally failed, certain danger had found me at last. I never imagined that the very man I feared discovering me would become, in time, the reason I finally stopped needing to hide at all." I will spend the rest of my life making certain you never need to fear anything again, Alistair said softly, and in the warm afternoon light of the rebuilt market square, surrounded by the ordinary, comfortable sounds of a town slowly healing from its own difficult year, Elena believed him completely, without a single trace of the doubt or fear that had once defined so much of her life. Their daughter, named Rosalind after Elena's own long-departed mother, grew up hearing pieces of the remarkable story of her parents throughout her childhood. Though the full details were carefully softened for younger ears, the frightening parts gradually replaced with the simpler truth that mattered most in the end. Her mother had once been lost, and her father had never once stopped searching, and love, patient and stubborn and unwilling to accept easy answers, had eventually found its way back to where it truly belonged. Marlow Hall itself, once a house frozen in grief and silence, became known throughout the surrounding countryside for its warmth and generosity. Its doors opened regularly to tenant families in need, its ledgers kept now with scrupulous, transparent honesty that Elena herself continued to oversee alongside her husband, a partnership built not on assumed authority, but on genuine, hard-earned mutual trust. The scandal of Edmund Marlow's crimes faded slowly into distant memory, spoken of occasionally as a cautionary tale, but never again allowed to cast its shadow over the family that had survived it and emerged, against every terrible odds, whole and unbroken on the other side. And on quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the candles burned low in the study where so much careful, desperate investigation had once unfolded, Alistair and Elena would sometimes sit together simply enjoying the ordinary piece of a life they had both, at different points, believed lost forever, grateful beyond words for the second chance that fate, and stubborn, unwavering love, had somehow granted them both.